My son wrote, "I've decided to sell your house to pay for my vacation with my wife. You have 24 hours to pack your things." I just smiled and handed over the keys. He had no idea that the house was actually— Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. There are houses that hold you the way arms cannot. My house on Clover Street was like that. A white 2-story colonial with green shutters, a porch that creaked in the same spot near the railing for 30 years, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood, no matter the season. Frank and I had bought it in 1987, young and foolish and full of plans. We raised Derek there, painted his bedroom ceiling with glow-in-the-dark stars, buried 2 dogs in the backyard under the old oak. And when Frank passed of a heart attack 11 years ago, I stayed, because leaving felt like dying twice. I kept the porch light on. I kept his chair at the kitchen table. I kept going. For most of those years, Derek had been a decent enough son. Not warm. He inherited Frank's jawline, but not his kindness. But present. He called on birthdays. He came for Thanksgiving when it suited him. After he married Tiffany 6 years ago, the visits thinned. She was a woman who calculated everything, including affection. I noticed it but said nothing. You learn, at 68, which battles to pick. The first signal came in February, about a year before everything unraveled. Derek called on a Tuesday. Unusual, since he normally only called on Sundays, and only briefly. His voice had that particular flatness it got when he was managing something, the same tone he used when he told me Frank's funeral arrangements were handled. He asked casually whether I had updated my will recently. I said I hadn't thought about it. He said I should. He recommended his own attorney, a man named Garrett, whose card he offered to mail me. I thanked him and hung up, and sat for a long moment at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold. I told myself it was reasonable. I was 67 at the time. It was a practical question. But the calls continued. Over the following months, Derek began asking other things. Had I considered downsizing? A woman my age, alone in a 4-bedroom house. Wasn't it a lot of upkeep? Tiffany's parents had moved into a senior community in Scottsdale and were, apparently, thriving. Had I looked into anything like that? There was one in Columbus with a lovely common area and organized activities. I had not looked into anything like that. Then came the visit in October. They arrived on a Saturday with a bottle of wine neither of them intended to share generously, and a mood I can only describe as prospecting. Tiffany walked through the downstairs rooms with her eyes doing arithmetic. She touched the fireplace mantel. She stood in the doorway of the dining room and said, "You know, with the right updates, this place would photograph beautifully." I asked her what she meant. She smiled and said, "Oh, it has good bones." Derek said nothing. He watched me the way he used to watch his father before asking to borrow the car. I began to pay attention differently after that. I went back through small moments I had discarded. The time Derek asked whether I still had the original deed paperwork, just for estate planning. The time Tiffany mentioned a real estate agent friend of hers who specialized in helping families transition properties smoothly. The time Derek asked, with manufactured casualness, whether the mortgage was fully paid off. It was. Had been since 2009. I started keeping a small notebook. I wrote things down. Dates, phrases, tones. I am not a dramatic woman. I do not catastrophize. But I am the daughter of a woman who survived things by paying attention, and I had begun to feel, in my chest, the particular cold that comes before something breaks. And then, on a Thursday morning in March, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. I read it standing in my kitchen, in my robe, with my first cup of coffee in my hand. "Mom, Tiffany and I have made a decision. We're going to sell the house to cover our vacation expenses and some other things we've been putting off. You have 24 hours to gather your things. We've already been in contact with a realtor. I read it 3 times. Then I set down my coffee, very carefully, so it wouldn't spill, and I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did, in the deep, wordless way only your children can hurt you. But because in that moment, standing in Frank's kitchen, in the house we had built together, I realized that Derek had just made the worst mistake of his life. He didn't know what I knew. He didn't know what the house actually was, and I had no intention of telling him yet. I went to find my keys. I drove to Carol's. Carol Whitman had been my closest friend since 1994, when our sons played Little League on the same team, and we spent an entire summer sitting on aluminum bleachers, complaining about the heat. She was a retired paralegal. Not a lawyer, she always clarified, but she knew more about property law than most people who were. I had called her from the car, hands steady on the wheel despite everything, and by the time I pulled into her driveway on Elmwood, she had coffee ready and her reading glasses on the table. I showed her the text. She read it once. Then she read it again. She set the phone down and looked at me over her glasses with an expression I recognized, the one she reserved for things that were both absurd and serious at the same time. "He thinks he can sell your house," she said. It was not a question. "Apparently. Based on what exactly? Does he have power of attorney? Is he on the deed?" "No," I said. "And no." Carol folded her hands on the table. "Then what does he think gives him the right?" That was the question, wasn't it? That was the thing I had turned over in my mind for the entire 15-minute drive. The cold, practical question underneath all the grief. Derek was not stupid. He had a business degree. He knew, in theory, how property ownership worked, which meant either he had been badly advised or he knew something I didn't, or, and this was the possibility that made my coffee taste like metal, someone had helped him believe he had grounds that he didn't. I told Carol everything. The phone calls over the past year, the October visit, Tiffany's eyes measuring my rooms, the questions about the deed, the mortgage, the will. Carol listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "Maggie, has anyone had access to your mail? Your documents?" I thought about it. The previous summer, Derek had stayed for 4 days while Tiffany visited her sister. He had slept in the guest room. He had been alone in the house on 2 mornings while I was at my garden club. The filing cabinet in the study, I had never locked it. Why would I? It was my house. The cold in my chest spread. "The filing cabinet," I said. Carol nodded slowly. "I think you need to do 2 things today. First, you need to call your attorney, not Garrett, your own attorney, the one Frank used. What's his name? Henderson. Bill Henderson. Call Bill Henderson today. And second," she paused, choosing her words, "I think you need to go home and go through every document in that filing cabinet and figure out what Derek has seen, and more importantly, what he thinks he saw." I drove home. The house felt different when I walked back in, not smaller, but watched, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath. I went directly to the study. The filing cabinet was a 4-drawer gray steel thing, nothing special, tucked beside Frank's old desk. I opened the top drawer. Everything looked undisturbed. But that means nothing. Photographs look undisturbed. Documents look undisturbed. You would only know something had been examined if something had been moved carelessly, and Derek, whatever his faults, had never been careless. I went through every folder. It took 2 hours, and I found what I was looking for. Or rather, I found what was missing. There was a folder, 3rd drawer, labeled simply House. Misk. Frank had made it. It contained old insurance documents, a survey from 1991, a copy of the original purchase agreement. What it did not contain, what I was almost certain it had once contained, was a handwritten note from Frank's mother, Eleanor Calloway, written in 1989. Eleanor had been a shrewd woman. She had lent us $40,000 toward the down payment, a significant sum in 1989, and had insisted, quietly and without fanfare, on a specific arrangement, not a gift, not a loan in the traditional sense, a legal instrument that Bill Henderson had drawn up and that all three of us had signed, a life estate arrangement with a private trust structure that Frank and I had formalized in 2003. The house was not simply mine in the colloquial sense. It was held in a trust of which I was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. A trust that explicitly, could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered by any heir without my written, notarized consent, and only after my death. Derek could no more sell my house than he could sell the moon. But if he had found only the purchase agreement, only the mortgage payoff document, only the surface layer, he might have convinced himself otherwise. Or someone might have convinced him. I sat at Frank's desk for a long time. The fear was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. Not fear of Derek, exactly, but fear of what it meant that my son had looked at my home and seen an asset to liquidate. Fear of what Tiffany had built in him over 6 years. Fear of how far they were willing to go. But underneath the fear, and this surprised me, was something harder. I had spent 40 years building something. Frank and I together, and then me alone. And I was not going to let it be taken by a man who thought 24 hours was a reasonable notice for his mother to vacate her life. I picked up the phone and called Bill Henderson. "Bill," I said when he answered, "I need to see you tomorrow morning. Something has come up with the house. I need to know exactly where we stand legally, and I need to know what my options are." Bill was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "First thing tomorrow, Maggie, 8 o'clock. I hung up. I looked around the study. At Frank's books still on the shelves. At the glow in the dark stars we'd never taken down from Derek's old bedroom ceiling, visible through the open door across the hall. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and I began to write. The plan was just an outline at that point, but it was a beginning. Bill Henderson's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that hadn't changed its facade since 1978. The elevator still had the original brass buttons. I had been coming here since Frank was alive, for wills and deed transfers and the occasional neighborly dispute, and the smell of the place, old paper and lemon polish, had always meant safety to me. Competence. Order. Bill was already at his desk when his assistant showed me in. 71 years old, trim, with reading glasses perpetually halfway down his nose. He had known Frank. He had drafted the trust documents himself. I sat down and told him everything. He did not look alarmed, which itself was steadying. He listened, made 2 notes on a legal pad, and then pulled up the trust documentation on his computer. He had scanned everything years ago, meticulous man, and walked me through it, point by point. The structure was exactly as I remembered. The house at 412 Clover Street was held in the Margaret and Francis Calloway Revocable Living Trust, established in 2003, amended in 2011, following Frank's death to make me the sole trustee. As trustee, I had complete control. No co-trustee. No beneficiary rights during my lifetime. Derek was named as the successor beneficiary, meaning he would inherit upon my death. But that right conveyed absolutely nothing to him while I was alive. He could not sell, could not encumber, could not even legally list the property. Any action he takes to sell this property, Bill said quietly, without your written and notarized consent, would constitute attempted fraud, potentially wire fraud, if he's communicated with a realtor in writing. He mentioned a realtor in the text, I said. Bill looked at me over his glasses. Do you still have that text? I screenshot it. He nodded slowly. Maggie, I want you to do something for me. I want you to do nothing outwardly for the next few days. Don't respond to Derek. Don't confirm or deny anything. Let me make some quiet inquiries. He paused. Do you know the name of the realtor he's supposedly been in contact with? I didn't, but I knew how to find out. I left Bill's office at 9:15 and sat in my car for a moment on Main Street, watching the morning go about its business. A woman walked a dog. The hardware store opened its door. Everything ordinary. Everything indifferent to the fact that my son had tried to sell my house. I drove home and did something I was not proud of, but which I would do again. I called Derek's number and let it go to voicemail, then immediately sent a text saying only, "Got your message. I'm thinking. Can you give me the realtor's contact info so I can understand the timeline?" It was a small deception. I was not thinking in the way he would have understood it, but I needed the name. He texted back within 4 minutes, which told me how eager he was. Her name is Stacy Vollmer, Vollmer Realty. She already has the address and is ready to move quickly. Just let us know when you're out. I saved the screenshot. I forwarded it to Bill. Then I called Carol. He's already in contact with a realtor, I told her. He gave me her name. Carol was quiet for a moment. That's not just an impulsive text anymore, Maggie. That's coordinated. She was right. The text on Thursday morning hadn't been a burst of cruelty or a thoughtless power move. It had been a deployment. They had already spoken to Stacy Vollmer. They had already discussed timelines. The 24 hours wasn't a threat. It was a schedule. That afternoon, I did something I had been putting off. I went through the rest of the filing cabinet with fresh eyes, not looking for what was missing now, but looking for anything that might tell me when Derek had been in it. And in the back of the 4th drawer, tucked behind a folder of old tax returns, I found something that made my hands go still. A photocopy. It was a photocopy of the original purchase agreement from 1987. The surface document, the one that listed Frank and me as buyers, that showed the purchase price and the mortgage terms. It did not include the trust amendment. It did not include Eleanor's arrangement. It showed only the simplest version of the transaction. 2 people bought a house. Someone had made this copy and left it behind. Carelessly, or perhaps deliberately. A record of what they had looked at. The paper had a faint crease pattern consistent with being folded into thirds, the way you would fold something to fit in a jacket pocket. Derek had made this copy during those 4 days last summer. He had stood in Frank's study, at Frank's desk, and photographed or copied this document and taken it with him. And he had built his entire plan on it. On the assumption that the purchase agreement was the whole story. He had never found the trust documents. He didn't know they existed. I sat very still. Then I put the photocopy in a separate envelope, labeled it with the date I found it, and put it in my purse. That evening, Carol came over for dinner. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had read Derek's text that Thursday morning, and I laid out everything. Bill's confirmation of the trust, the text exchange with Derek, Stacy Vollmer's name, the photocopy. Carol looked at the photocopy for a long time. "He went through your papers," she said. "Yes." "And he built a case on an incomplete document." "Yes." She looked up at me. "Maggie, do you understand what you have here?" I did. I had documentation of his intent. I had evidence of coordinated action with a third party. I had proof that he had accessed my private documents without permission, and I had a legal structure so solid that not a single thing he planned could succeed, not one, without my signature. He had handed me everything I needed. The question now was not whether I could protect the house. The question was what I wanted to do with what I knew. I thought about it that night, lying in my bedroom, looking at the ceiling. By morning, I knew the answer. The first thing I did was call Bill Henderson and tell him to proceed. We had outlined 3 steps during our meeting, and I had spent the night confirming in my own mind that I wanted all 3. The first was a formal cease and desist letter to Derek, sent by Bill's office, informing him that the property at 412 Clover Street was held in trust, that he had no legal standing to initiate or coordinate any sale, and that any further contact with real estate agents, potential buyers, or financial institutions regarding this property would constitute actionable fraud. The second was a formal letter to Stacy Vollmer of Vollmer Realty, informing her of the trust structure and putting her on notice that any listing of the property without trustee consent would expose her and her brokerage to legal liability. The third, and this one I had added the night before, was a formal inquiry to the county recorder's office requesting confirmation that no unauthorized documents had been filed against the property. That last one was Carol's suggestion. "People do strange things when they think they have momentum," she had said. "Make sure he hasn't tried to file anything." He hadn't. The county recorder confirmed it within 48 hours. The cease and desist letters went out on a Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, Derek called. I was in the garden when the phone rang. Early April, the tulips just coming up along the front walk. The air still carrying winter underneath its surface warmth. I looked at his name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. "Mom." His voice was controlled, but only just. I had heard that tone before, when he was a teenager and I had caught him in something he couldn't talk his way out of. The controlled voice was always a sign that something underneath it was not controlled at all. "I got a letter from a lawyer." "I know," I said. I sent it. Silence. Then, "What is this? What is this trust? I've never heard of any trust." "You were never meant to administer it," I said pleasantly. "You're a beneficiary, Derek, a future one. That's different from having rights. You're doing this to spite me." "I'm doing this because you contacted a realtor about my home without my knowledge or consent. You gave me 24 hours to leave. I'm responding appropriately." More silence. When he spoke again, the control had slipped a notch. "Tiffany says this can be challenged. She says trusts like this can be contested. Tiffany is welcome to consult an attorney," I said. "She'll be told the same thing Bill Henderson will tell you if you call him directly. This trust is valid, properly recorded, and unassailable. There is nothing to contest." He hung up. I stood among my tulips for a moment. Then I went back inside. The escalation came on Saturday. They arrived at the house at 11 in the morning. Both of them, unannounced, their car pulling into my driveway with the particular aggression of people who have decided that showing up in person is a form of argument. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment before opening the door. Derek was taut with something, anger or embarrassment, or the particular species of shame that looks like anger. Tiffany was composed in the manner of someone who has rehearsed. She was wearing the kind of casual blazer that is specifically chosen to signal that one is serious. I opened the door before they knocked. "I didn't invite you," I said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. "We need to talk," Derek said. "Then you should have called first." I did not step back from the door. "What do you want to say?" What followed was 30 minutes that I will not recount in full, because the details were repetitive and the emotional texture was deeply unpleasant. Derek told me I was being unreasonable. Tiffany, in her practiced voice, explained that they had financial obligations that I was making impossible to address. She suggested that the trust was probably outdated and that surely, as family, we could come to an arrangement. She used the word arrangement 4 times. At one point, Derek said, "You're going to die in that house alone and leave it to what? A charity?" I looked at him for a moment. "I might," I said. "That's my right." Then Tiffany's composure cracked, just briefly, and she said something I had not expected. "We know you have money in that account from when Frank's mother died. We know about the inheritance." I kept my face very still, because Eleanor Calloway had not left a public estate. Her assets had passed through a private trust directly to me in 2018. It was not a matter of public record. The only way Tiffany could know about it, the only way, was if Derek had told her. And the only way Derek could know was if he had found something in my files. "I think you should leave now," I said. Derek stepped forward. Not threateningly, but the step was meant to signal something. "We're not done." "You are on my property," I said very quietly. "You were asked to leave. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." Not as a dramatic gesture, as a practical one. Something in my voice, or perhaps Bill Henderson's letter still fresh in his mind, made Derek stop. They left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, my hand on the wall, letting my pulse settle. Then I did something I had not done in several years. I called my daughter-in-law, Sandra, Frank's niece, really, but we had always called her that, who lived in Cincinnati, and I told her I needed a few days away. She said, "Come now, Maggie. Come tonight." I packed a bag. I asked Carol to check on the house. I drove to Cincinnati on Saturday evening, and I spent 4 days in Sandra's spare room, walking her dog in the mornings, eating dinner with her family in the evenings, and letting my mind rest from the weight of my own home. I needed it, not as retreat, as preparation. When I drove back on Wednesday, I felt the difference. The cold in my chest had settled into something quieter, more deliberate, something that knew exactly what it was doing. I came home to a full voicemail box, 3 messages from Derek, left across the 4 days I was gone. The first was formal, something about working this out like adults. The second was warmer, almost cajoling, with a tone I recognized from his childhood when he wanted something and had decided that niceness might work where arguing had not. The third was Tiffany, not Derek, which was unusual. Her voice was measured, even gentle. She said they had been thinking and they wanted to reset the conversation. She said she hoped I knew they loved me, that this was just about practical realities, and that she thought if we sat down together without attorneys or letters in between us, we might find a solution that worked for everyone. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to all 3 messages back to back. Then I deleted them, not out of anger, out of clarity. I had heard the same speech before, restructured 3 different ways. The architecture was always identical. Soften the approach, reframe the demand as mutual benefit, suggest that my resistance was the problem rather than their original action. It was the kind of persuasion that works on people who have not yet decided what they want. I had decided. The following Monday, something else arrived. A card, in a pale blue envelope, handwritten. Inside, a gift card to my favorite garden supply store, the one on Route 40, where I bought my bulbs every fall. and a note in Tiffany's handwriting that read, "No pressure, no agenda. Just thinking of you. D&T, $50 toward petunias, as the price of my home." I put the gift card in a drawer. I did not use it. I did not throw it away. I kept it because it was documentation of an attempt to influence me while legal proceedings were in motion. Carol thought I was being overly cautious. Bill Henderson, when I told him, said, "Keep everything." I kept everything. What I noticed in the days that followed was that the calls and messages had stopped. Derek and Tiffany had shifted from pressure to surveillance. I could feel it, not literally, but in the way that people who know you begin to move differently around you when they're waiting for something. Derek's social media, which I still checked occasionally and against my better judgment, showed him and Tiffany at a restaurant, then at a weekend trip, performing normalcy with the particular effort of people who are managing an audience. Tiffany posted a picture of a beautifully arranged kitchen counter, neutral tones, clean lines, with a caption about creating the life you want. The life she wanted appeared to involve my house. I found my support, as it often happens, not in one dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of ordinary people who gave me ordinary things at the right time. Sandra called every other day from Cincinnati. She had 3 grown children of her own and no illusions about family dynamics. "You are not doing anything wrong," she told me in her flat, practical way one Tuesday morning while I was deadheading roses. "You are protecting what is yours. Anyone who tells you that makes you selfish is trying to take something from you." My neighbor, Ruth, who was 74 and had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son, came over for tea one afternoon, and I told her more than I intended to. She listened, and then she said something I wrote in my notebook afterward. "The cruelest thing a child can do to a parent is make them feel that their love was the vehicle for the betrayal." I sat with that for a long time. At my garden club, I said nothing specific. I am not a woman who broadcasts her troubles. But Linda Marsh, who had navigated her own complicated estate situation several years prior, mentioned, unprompted, the name of a trust litigation specialist in Columbus. "Just in case," she said. "You never know." I wrote the name down. I also did something I had been considering since Carol first asked about my mail. I installed new locks. Not dramatically. I called a locksmith, had the deadbolts changed on both exterior doors and the sliding door to the back patio, and collected the new keys myself. I also went through the house methodically and secured anything of documentary value. The trust documents themselves. Bill had the originals, the folder of financial records, the small fireproof box in the bedroom closet that held my passport and Frank's death certificate, and the deed to my cemetery plot. I was not being paranoid. I was being thorough. And in the evenings, I sat on my porch in the April dusk and watched the light change over the old oak in the backyard, and I thought about Frank, and I thought about what he would have made of all this. He would have been heartbroken, I think. He had loved Derek in that uncomplicated, wholehearted way that some fathers manage. But he also had a hard streak of justice in him. He would not have been surprised by Tiffany. He had met women like her before, and he had always known them for what they were within minutes. "Some people walk into a room and count what's in it," he told me once. "Others walk in and see who's in it. You can tell a lot about a person by which they do first." I thought about Tiffany standing in my dining room doorway, her eyes moving over the walls. I thought about what was coming, and I was ready. They came on a Sunday, 2 weeks after the gift card, and this time Derek had called ahead, which should have been reassuring, but wasn't. He called on Saturday evening, his voice carefully modulated, and said they wanted to take me to brunch. His treat. "Somewhere nice," he said. "The new place on Jefferson. the one that had opened last fall. He had made a reservation. He asked if 11 o'clock worked. I said it did. I also called Carol that night and told her. "Don't go to their turf," Carol said immediately. "Meet somewhere neutral or at your house." I thought about it. Then I said, "My house. I'll make coffee. I want this to happen on ground I control." I called Derek back and told him that brunch out wasn't convenient, but they were welcome to come for coffee at 10. There was a pause, brief, calculating, and then he agreed. They arrived at 10:02. Tiffany carried a box of pastries from the good bakery downtown, which meant she had planned this before Derek called me. She presented them with a smile that was warm in the way that stage lighting is warm, technically correct, generating no actual heat. We sat in the living room. I had not set up the kitchen table. The living room was more formal, and I wanted formal. I poured coffee from the carafe I had prepared, and I let them arrange themselves on the sofa while I took Frank's chair. The chair was a small choice, but it was not an accident. Derek began with 5 minutes of what I could only call atmospheric preparation. How nice the house looked, how good my garden was coming along, how much they had missed spending time with me. Tiffany nodded at intervals and offered soft, corroborating sounds. It was a practiced performance, and it would have worked on someone who needed to be reassured that they were loved. I did not need that. I waited. The turn came when Derek set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly, and I recognized the posture. He used to do the same thing as a boy when he was about to negotiate. "Mom," he said, "we want to apologize for how this started. The text it was too abrupt. We know that, and we're sorry." "Thank you," I said. He looked slightly wrong-footed by the brevity of my response. He had expected more. Relief, softening, the opening he needed. He pressed on. "But the underlying situation is real," he said. "We're stretched financially. Tiffany and I have obligations, the mortgage on the condo, her mother's medical costs, some business debts I haven't talked about. We're not asking you to be homeless, Mom. We would never ask that." He paused. "There are options. We've looked into senior living communities." "Derek," I said. "I'm going to stop you there." He stopped. "I know what this conversation is," I said, "and I appreciate that you've delivered it more carefully than a text message. But the answer to the underlying question is no. The house is not available to you. Not now. Not as a sale. Not as any arrangement that requires me to leave it." Tiffany shifted. Her voice came in smoothly, rehearsed. "Maggie, we're not asking you to see it as a loss. We're asking you to see it as an evolution. You've spent so much of your life maintaining this place alone. Wouldn't it be freeing to—" "Freeing," I repeated. She caught something in the word and hesitated. "Tiffany," I said, very calmly, "you mentioned when you were last here that you knew about the inheritance from Eleanor Calloway's estate. I'd like to know how you know that." The room went quiet. Tiffany's eyes moved to Derek. It was a fast look, almost involuntary, and in a court of law it would have meant nothing. But in a living room, between people who know each other, it meant everything. Derek said, I think you mentioned it at some point. Years ago." "I didn't," I said. "I've never discussed Eleanor's estate with you. It wasn't relevant to you. It passed privately." "Mom, that's not—" "I also want to know," I continued, keeping my voice even, "what else you may have found when you were in my study last summer." The silence was of a different quality now. Tiffany's posture had changed, the practiced openness tightening into something angular and alert. Derek's jaw had shifted in the way that meant he was recalculating. "You went through my files," I said. It was not a question. "I was looking for the insurance documents," Derek said. "For the car. You asked me to—" "The car insurance is in the glove compartment," I said. It has been in the glove compartment for 30 years. He had no answer to that. Tiffany leaned forward. The warm, lighting smile was gone entirely now. Maggie, I want to be honest with you. And then she said something that removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of this visit. You are 78, 68, 68 years old. You are living alone. You are one fall, one diagnosis, one crisis away from needing full-time care. We are trying to help you plan for that reality before it becomes an emergency. If you refuse to be reasonable, we will have no choice but to look into whether a competency evaluation might be appropriate. The room was very still. I sat with it for a moment. A competency evaluation. The implication being that a woman who refused to hand over her home was, by definition, not fully in possession of her faculties. I felt something cold move through me. And yes, I will be honest, I felt afraid. Not of the evaluation itself, which had no basis and would go nowhere, but of the willingness to say it. Of the distance my son and his wife had traveled to reach the point where that sentence could be spoken in my living room, over good coffee and bakery pastries on a Sunday morning. I think you should leave, I said. Derek stood. Mom, I'd like you to leave now, I said. And I'd like you to know that this conversation has been noted, the date, and the substance of it, and my attorney will be informed. Tiffany stood, smoothing her blazer, her expression reassembling itself into something cool and final. We're only trying to help, she said. I know what you're trying to do, I said. They left. I sat in Frank's chair for a very long time after the sound of their car faded from the driveway. The fear was real, and I let myself feel it. Because denying it would have been foolish, and I was not a foolish woman. They had shown me their bottom card. They were willing to question my competency, which meant they were either desperate or genuinely believed it would work. But fear, I have learned, can be fuel. I picked up my phone. I called Bill Henderson's cell. I told him about the competency remark. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's harassment, Maggie. That's actionable. I know, I said. Good, he said. Then let's make sure it counts for something. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning in May in Bill Henderson's conference room on the second floor of his Main Street building. It had been Bill's idea, and I had agreed without hesitation. He called Derek directly, not through me, and informed him that there were matters relating to the Callaway estate that required Derek's presence, that it was in his interest to attend, and that he was welcome to bring his own attorney if he chose to. Derek arrived with a man named Philip Kwan, a general practice lawyer from a firm in Columbus, young and reasonably confident in the way of people who haven't yet been in a room where they were entirely outmatched. Tiffany came too, though she had not been specifically invited. She sat beside Derek in one of Bill's gray upholstered chairs and arranged herself as his support and advisor, her hands folded on the table over a yellow legal pad on which she had apparently prepared notes. I arrived first. I wore the blue dress I had worn to Frank's funeral. Not as a statement, but because it was the most composed thing I owned, and composure was what I wanted to carry into that room. Bill opened the meeting without preamble. He was like that. He laid a folder on the table and began. First, the trust documents. He went through the legal structure clearly and methodically. The creation in 2003, the amendment in 2011, the recorded status with the county, the explicit language prohibiting any transfer, sale, or encumbrance during the trustee's lifetime without notarized trustee consent. Philip Kwan read along. His expression, as he read, shifted from polite attention to something quieter. Derek said, I didn't know about this trust. That's apparent, Bill said. However, not knowing about it doesn't alter its legal force. Then Bill opened a second folder. This one contained the cease and desist letter and its delivery confirmation. The documented contact with Stacy Vollmer of Vollmer Realty. Stacy had, when contacted by Bill's office, provided a written account of her exchanges with Derek, in which Derek had represented himself as having authority to list the property. That representation, Bill explained, constituted fraud regardless of whether a sale was ever completed. Philip Kwan made a small sound. He leaned toward Derek and said something in a low voice. Derek stared at the table. Then Bill produced the photocopy, the copy of the 1987 purchase agreement that I had found in my filing cabinet. He explained when and where I had found it and what its presence implied. He noted that entering a private residence and removing or copying private documents without consent was, depending on interpretation, a violation of privacy statutes. Tiffany's legal pad remained unopened. This is circumstantial, Philip Kwan said carefully. A photocopy in a filing cabinet could have been there for any number of reasons. It could, Bill agreed pleasantly, which is why I obtained a statement from Ms. Vollmer regarding the representations Derek made about his legal authority, which is decidedly not circumstantial. He paused. I also have a written record of a statement made to my client, Mrs. Calloway, during a visit on the 12th of this month, in which Mrs. Derek Calloway suggested that a competency evaluation might be sought if Mrs. Calloway refused to comply with their requests. Philip Kwan put down his pen. He turned to Derek. Did you make that representation? Derek looked at Tiffany. It was that look again. The same involuntary look I had seen in my living room, fast and helpless and utterly legible. He was looking at her because it had been her idea. Anyone in the room could read it. Tiffany's composure held for about 4 more seconds. Then she said, We were concerned for her welfare. That's all that was. Using the threat of a competency proceeding to coerce an elderly homeowner into vacating a property, Bill said, is elder financial abuse under Ohio law. That is not a civil matter. That is criminal exposure. The room went very still. Derek said, That's not... We weren't... Derek, Philip Kwan said quietly. Stop talking. It was at that moment, I think, that Derek understood the situation completely. I watched it happen. His face went through 3 or 4 things in quick succession. Argument, indignation, calculation, and then, at the bottom of all of them, something that might have been recognition. The plan had not been a plan. It had been a fantasy built on an incomplete document and the assumption that his mother was manageable. I had not been manageable. I had been waiting. Tiffany, across the table, was not finished. I will give her this. She was tenacious, she said, in a voice from which all the warmth had been stripped. You could still be reasonable about this. You could still choose to... Tiffany, I said. She stopped. I had not spoken since we sat down. It was the first time I'd said her name in the room, and I said it quietly, with no particular force, which is sometimes more arresting than volume. I want you to hear me clearly, I said. This house was built by 2 people who worked for 40 years to have it. My husband is buried 10 miles from here. I have lived in this house for 37 years. I will continue to live in it. I will not be frightened out of it, and I will not be manipulated out of it, and I will not be legally maneuvered out of it, because the law is not on your side. It is entirely and without exception on mine. I looked at Derek. You are my son, I said. I love you in the way that doesn't go away regardless of what you do. But what you did, both of you, was not a misunderstanding or a financial stress response or a communication failure. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. Philip Kwan was writing rapidly. Derek said nothing. For the first time in this entire episode, he had nothing to say. Bill placed one final document on the table. "Mrs. Calloway has no interest in criminal prosecution at this time," he said. "What she requires is a signed acknowledgement from both of you that you have no claim, legal or equitable, on the property at 412 Clover Street during Mrs. Calloway's lifetime. She further requires a signed commitment that neither of you will initiate any competency or guardianship proceedings against her without a documented medical recommendation from her own physician." Philip Kwan looked at the documents. Then he looked at his client. Derek signed. Tiffany, after a long pause, signed. I watched them sign, and I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph, no grief, no catharsis. Just the particular quiet of a thing being made permanent. I picked up my copy of the agreement, folded it in thirds, the same way a document looks when it's been carried somewhere carefully, and put it in my purse. Then I thanked Bill, stood, and walked out into the May morning without looking back. The day after the meeting, I planted dahlias along the back fence. Frank had always liked dahlias, thought they looked serious, which was his highest compliment for flowers. I dug the holes in the good morning dirt, feeling the soil give under my hands, and I thought about consequences. About how long they take to arrive, and how completely they arrive when they finally do. The consequences in the weeks that followed were administrative and irrevocable, which is the most complete kind. Bill Henderson filed the formal record of the signed agreement with the county. It was attached to the property file, a permanent, searchable document establishing that Derek Calloway had no legal standing regarding the property at 412 Clover Street during his mother's lifetime. Any future challenge would face not only the trust structure, but this signed acknowledgement, in Derek's own hand, obtained in the presence of his own attorney. Stacy Vollmer's brokerage sent a formal written apology to Bill's office. She had not known the property was in trust and had acted in good faith on Derek's fraudulent representations. Bill was measured in his response. No further action, provided the matter was fully closed. It was closed. 3 weeks later, Bill called. "Maggie," he said, "Derek may be facing some scrutiny regarding his business debts. It appears he represented a property to a private lender as incoming inheritance, timeline, flexible." I was quiet for a moment. "He borrowed against my house." "Apparently so. I wanted you to know in case you were contacted. Any communication should come through me." I thanked him and hung up. I sat on the porch that evening and thought about that for a long time. Derek had not just sent an angry text one Thursday morning. He had told a lender a lie he may have half believed himself, had built a financial structure on a foundation that had never existed, because the alternative was that he had known it was a lie from the beginning, which was a different and darker thing entirely. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired and sad and clear. The sadness was for the boy who had slept under glow-in-the-dark stars, who had cried at his father's funeral with his whole body the way children do even when they're grown. That boy had been real. This man was also real. Both of them were my son. But I had not created the situation. I had only refused to lose because of it. Carol came for dinner that Friday, and we sat on the porch with wine as the neighborhood settled into evening, the street going quiet in the particular way it does in late spring when the light holds longer than you expect. "So it's done?" she asked. "The legal part is done," I said. "The rest will take longer. It always does." She nodded, looking out at the yard. "And the house?" I looked at the old oak at the back, the fresh-turned soil along the fence, where the dahlias were just beginning to settle in. "The house is mine," I said. "It always was." She raised her glass. I raised mine. "To Frank," I said. "To Frank," she agreed. What Derek and Tiffany had miscalculated was not the legal structure. They could be forgiven, in theory, for not knowing about the trust. What they had miscalculated was the person. They had looked at a 68-year-old woman living alone in a 4-bedroom house and seen something that could be moved, something that could be pressured or frightened or worn down into yielding. They had not seen what Frank had seen when he met me at 26. They had not seen what my father had passed to me without ever naming it. They had not seen what I was made of. They knew now. I said goodnight to Carol, went inside, locked the new deadbolt, washed my glass and turned off the kitchen light. And I went to bed in my house on Clover Street where I had always lived and where I intended to stay. By summer, the dahlias had opened. They came in deep red and amber. Serious colors, Frank's colors. And they lined the back fence in a way that made the yard look intentional, cared for, permanently inhabited. I photographed them one morning in the low early light and had the print framed. It hung in the kitchen next to the window where I could see it while I made coffee. My life in the months after had a quality I can only describe as spaciousness. I joined a twice-weekly watercolor class at the community center, something I had deferred for years. I was terrible for the first month, adequate for the second, and by fall, I had painted the oak in my backyard and given it to Sandra in Cincinnati, who hung it in her hallway. I also joined the local Historical Preservation Society. My house, a 1952 colonial in original condition, was of genuine interest to their catalog project. It gave me something unexpected, the sense that the house was part of something larger than my own life. Carol and I kept our Friday dinners. She was, and remains, one of the steady things. I saw Derek once, in September. We met at a diner on Route 40. Nothing special. He came alone. He told me the lender situation had been resolved at significant cost. He had liquidated his investment accounts and was carrying the consequences without Tiffany's help because Tiffany had left in August. She had left when it became clear that the plan had failed. Not that the marriage had died for complicated reasons. The plan had failed, and she had gone. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the text, for what happened in your house, for all of it." It was not a complete apology, but I know my son's voice, and I know when he means something. "I hear you," I said. We did not hug, but he held the door for me, and when I drove home, the weight was not heavier than when I had left. As for Tiffany, she had moved to Columbus and taken a position at a property management company, new rooms to assess. I hoped, without malice, that she would eventually find something she valued that couldn't be sold. On a Tuesday evening in November, I sat on the porch with tea as the last light left the sky. The dahlias had gone in for the season, cut back and waiting. The street was quiet. I thought about what it means to stay, not from inertia, but as an act. To plant something, to hang a photograph, to be in a place so completely that it becomes part of the evidence of who you are. I brought my cup inside. I turned on the porch light. Same fixture, same yellow circle on the same front steps. Continuous since Frank installed it in 1991. The house held me, as it always had, and I held it back. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it.